Friday the 13th, Jason's Curse by Eric Morse. Prologue. Gone Fishing. It was a little before 6 on a warm May morning. Above the thick mass of pine trees, the sun, a huge ball of orange, was just beginning to rise over Crystal Lake. At this hour, the glassy surface of the water was hidden under a thick layer of mist. Everywhere you looked, streaks of gray gently rose and fell like restless ghosts. Way out toward the middle of the lake, partly hidden by the mist, floated an old white rowboat. The large man in the rowboat was sitting so still he might almost have been a boulder or some other part of the scenery. He was holding a fishing rod with both hands. He stared straight ahead. The man shivered. Ma was right, he thought. Coming out here barefoot, wearing just overalls and his fishing cap, it hadn't been such a good idea. Breathing heavily through his mouth, the big man started to rewind his reel. There was no tension on the line, and Big Red asked the question he asked himself every morning. Why didn't he ever catch a fish? Maybe it was because he always forgot to bring the bait. Big Red had a routine. He woke up around 5. First things first, he reattached his artificial leg. Then he stuck in his glass eyeball and went out to the outhouse to do his business. Then he fed the slop and garbage to the hogs, Sally, May, and Delilah. That was Big Red's morning chore. He never forgot his morning chore. Well, it was easy to remember, because the hogs started squealing the moment they saw him come out of the shack. Gee, he loved those hogs. Then what he did next was he searched for a scrap of newspaper and a pencil, and he wrote Ma and Pa a note. Gone fishing. He left them the same note every morning, so they'd know where he'd gone. It seemed like he was always out in the middle of the lake by the time he remembered the worms. Pa said you needed worms to catch fish. Well, this was his favorite part of fishing anyway. Slowly turning the handle and listening to that tick-tick sound as the plastic line wound itself around the reel again and again. Big Red kept slowly winding the crank handle until at last the silver fishhook sprang up out of the dark water, glinting in the sunlight. The hook was empty. No fish. Big Red was disappointed, but in a way he was glad as well. He didn't like the idea of the hook's 3 sharp prongs slashing into the soft mouth of some poor creature. Big Red had never been able to hurt anyone, not even a flea, which he always seemed to have plenty of. He raised the long rod over his head and cast the hook as far as he could. He watched for the tiny splash as the hook hit the water, 30 yards away. Then he sat very still, letting the hook settle to the bottom. After a few minutes, Red started his favorite part of fishing all over again. He rewound the reel, except this time he felt it almost at once. There was a tug on the line. A gentle tug, to be sure, but a real tug nevertheless. Something was nibbling on the hook. The first thing that appeared in Red's good eye was fear, almost as if he'd done something wrong. His mouth fell open. Then his heart started to pound. Oh my God, he had finally caught one. Frowning with concentration, Big Red started rewinding the reel, not slowly like he usually did, but as fast as he could. The fish at the other end tugged harder. The rod bent over, pointing down at the water. He had caught a whopper. Boy, would Ma and Pa be surprised. He could almost see the surprised look on their faces when he brought in this fish. Now it would be Big Red's turn to pose for a snapshot outside the fish and bait, holding up his prize. Everyone would slap him on the back. Everyone would be proud of him. Everyone. As he rewound the line faster and faster, Red got so worked up he couldn't sit still. He started tapping his good foot, slapping it up and down in the dank water at the bottom of the boat. He was giggling as the fish sprang up out of the water. It was so big and white, it made Big Red gasp. Except it wasn't a fish. He stared at his catch, spinning slowly at the end of the line. His face fell. Carefully, he removed the white thing from the hook and stared at it. Instead of a fish, Big Red had caught a thin white plastic disc. The disc was pitted with little black holes. Near the top there were two big black holes like eyes. Near the bottom was one big black hole like a mouth. The round white thing reminded Big Red of something. Suddenly he remembered what it was. He lifted his head straight up, looking up at the sky for the moon. The rays of sunlight slanted down on his face, making him squint. No moon. He had forgotten what time of day it was. But Big Red was right. The thing in his hands did look a little bit like the man in the moon. Big Red had once asked his ma why the man in the moon looked so sad all the time. Ma had said it was because the man in the moon felt sorry for Big Red, felt sorry for the big man who couldn't have a job or a wife like other men his age. Ever since then, Big Red had liked the man in the moon very much. Red hugged the white plastic disc tightly against his overalls with his large, soft hands. Then he turned it over. On the back of the disc was a black plastic strap, like it was a mask. Big Red had an idea. He lifted the white mask to his face. The mask was cold and wet and smelled mossy like the lake water that Big Red sometimes drank. He carefully positioned the plastic strap over the back of his big bald head. Then he fitted the mask over his face so that his one good baby blue eye stared out the eye hole. Right away there was this sucking sound. Big Red gasped. The mask seemed to be attaching itself to his face like some huge leech. Big Red's hands gripped the sides of the mask, trying to pull it off, but it was too late. He couldn't budge it. Then the pain came. Big Red screamed. He clutched his head. It felt like someone was reaching into his body and clawing out his insides, as if the three prongs of his fishhook had gone up his nose and were pulling out his brain. He thought the pain would never stop. When it finally passed, Big Red sat very still. His left eye was tingling, which was strange, because that was his glass eye. He'd lost his real eye whenever he was 12. Then the tingling started in his left leg, which was also strange. He had lost his left leg whenever he was 14. Quickly, the sensation spread to the V-shaped indentation in his bald head, which he'd had as long as he could remember. And then it was as if his entire body were shaking violently, but only on the inside, as if all the cells of his body were opening up, like doors unlocking. Hidden behind his mask, Big Red's face turned as red as his name. A new feeling began flashing through him like wildfire. It was a feeling Big Red had never felt before, but still he knew the names for it. It was anger. It was fury. It was hate. Big Red clenched his large square hands into big fists. He knew what he had to do. Behind the mask, his glass eye turned slowly and squeakily in its socket. The glass eye pointed toward the shore. Chapter 1. Kelly. At the same moment that Big Red was putting on the mask in the middle of Crystal Lake, Kelly Boone was standing in the kitchen of her funky off-campus housing share in Newkirk, Massachusetts, dealing with a headache that felt like a fishhook in her brain. The pain, along with her nervousness and worrying, had kept her up all night, yet again. "Oh, God," she mumbled. She leaned against the kitchen counter, which was covered with dirty dishes, open boxes of cereal, and other junk, and held her forehead with both hands. She'd been having the migraines all year, ever since last May. Ever since... Kelly opened the cabinet sharply, as if trying to snap the thought out of her brain. She found the Tylenol bottle. When had she taken the last 3 pills? 4 in the morning? 5? Too soon for more. She put the bottle back. The pain was beginning to subside anyway. She was a tall and very pretty girl who had just turned 18. She had dirty blonde hair, an open face, and frank gray-blue eyes. But that wasn't the thing that first struck people about her. One look at Kelly and people could tell that something awful had happened to her. She was marked. in a way that made strangers who passed her in the street turn to glance back at her, as if they thought they knew her. Right now, her pretty features had an almost grayish cast. She wiped sweat from her face with the long sleeve of her army fatigues jacket. Pain. It had come to seem to her like a wily enemy. And whenever the pain disappeared, Kelly always suspected a trick, as if her headache was just retreating, so it could ambush her again. She had her head bent low, and she found herself staring down at a half-eaten plum on the counter that was attracting fruit flies. She tossed the soggy pit in the trash. Of the 9 college students and dropouts who shared this rundown house on the outskirts of town, only 5 were actually paying any rent, and only 2, Kelly's boyfriend Doug and Doug's ex-girlfriend Lisa, were actually on the lease. And out of the 9, only Kelly ever did any serious cleaning up. She didn't care. She mostly did the cleaning on the nights when she couldn't sleep. The dark nights when the demons came to get her. Sometimes cleaning the house seemed like the only thing keeping her sane. May was a particularly bad month for Kelly. She figured it was probably going to be that way for the rest of her life. Last May, she was still in high school, and life seemed kind of a gas. Last May, her older brother Boone was still living at home, over the garage. Last May. The Mr. Coffee machine suddenly sputtered loudly as the last drops of water dripped through the filter. Gritting her teeth, Kelly picked up a mug out of the sink, rinsed some water in and out. She filled the mug with coffee so close to the brim she had to stand by the machine sipping for a couple of minutes before she could transport the cup to the kitchen table. She had cleaned and scrubbed the table tonight, even using her long hunting knife to pick out the crud that clogged the seam in the middle between the 2 wooden leaves. The only thing sitting on the table now was her black spiral notebook. The notebook. She carefully set down the coffee, then hunted in the clutter on the counter for the seashell ashtray. Sitting down in front of the notebook, she lit an unfiltered Camel. Last June, she'd been watching TV in the middle of the night and had seen a program about the controversy over the Joe Camel ads. Critics said the ads were aimed directly at kids. They said that Joe Camel was now as familiar a cartoon character among little kids as Mickey Mouse. They also said that unfiltered Camels were among the deadliest cigarettes in the world. Kelly had been smoking Camels ever since. She inhaled deeply, once, twice. Then and only then did she open the notebook. Whenever he could get a hold of her on the phone, Kelly's dad always got her on case for not applying to college. "What do you do with your time?" he usually ended up shouting. Kelly never answered that question. How could she explain her schedule? "Gee, Dad, mostly I stay up all night and sleep all day. Mostly I walk around like a zombie trying to remember who I am." Since school, Kelly had held a series of lousy part-time jobs, like being cashier at the Serious Runner out of the Owings Mills Mall. People had always thought of her brother Boone as being so irresponsible. But the truth was that if Boone said he was going to do something or be somewhere at such and such time, he'd always showed up at that time, on the dot. He had taught Kelly to do the same, and she always had until this year. One job after the next, she kept showing up late or sleeping through her entire shift, or going off on 3-day camping trips in the woods without telling anyone, until sure enough, she'd get fired. Other than getting fired, this notebook is what she did. She'd spent hour after hour at the public library. Sometimes she borrowed Doug's beat-up Volvo and drove into Cambridge to use Harvard's Widener Library. Her old friend Carly lent her ID. Over the course of the year, she had gathered pretty much every clipping there was to gather on the events that had occurred over the years in the little backwoods town of Crystal Lake. She'd stared down at the first entry, a photocopy of a tiny article in the Crystal Gazette. Boy drowns at new camp. This was how it all started. 2 counselors got horny and went off somewhere, so they weren't watching the waterfront, and this little boy, Jason, drowned in the lake. Then came the murders, Enough murders over the years to shut down that campsite, but good. Enough murders to start the rumors. The locals believed that the dead boy kept coming back from the grave and taking his revenge. Since he had spent most of his youth underwater, legend had it that Jason wore a white hockey mask to hide his bloated and rotted face. It was a monster legend, pure and simple, like the Loch Ness Monster. At first, Kelly hadn't believed a word of it. She kept turning the pages, pausing for big gulps of coffee and long drags on her cigarette. Then she stopped. She didn't want to turn to the next page. When she did turn the page, the headline seemed to scream up at her, burning into her eyes. Hunter's death spree claims 7. Photos of bodies strewn through the woods. One of the most shocking photos showed a young man lying in the dirt, his head blown off. Before she could slam the notebook shut, the bold print of the caption jumped out at her. Identified as the body of 21-year-old William Boone. Kelly stubbed out her cigarette viciously. She rocked back and forth. She pressed her fingertips against her eyes, as if trying to squeeze the images out. Boone had taken 6 kids out to the old campsite, the one she and Boone had discovered backpacking just a few weeks before. Only Carly McDonald, a friend of Kelly's from high school, had come out alive. One of the things that kept gnawing at her was that Kelly was supposed to have been there too. She had had a sore throat that weekend, the one time she couldn't go off camping with her wild and fun-loving brother. The thought that always came next for Kelly was one of the worst. When she thought these words, it felt like someone was reaching right into her guts and twisting viciously. Maybe if I'd been there, maybe I could have saved him. Kelly opened the notebook again and flipped quickly ahead, past the articles about the murders all the way to Carly's letter. Most kids thought of Carly as a priss, because she always got straight A's and wouldn't party hardy, as Boone liked to say. Kelly had never thought of her like that. She knew Carly was tough in her own way. It didn't really surprise her that Carly had made it out of there. Last fall, Carly had gone off to Harvard, which didn't surprise Kelly either. Carly had tutored Kelly in calculus, so Kelly knew firsthand what a brain she was. When Kelly first started her informal research project on Crystal Lake, she used to call Carly all the time, begging her to tell her what had really happened out there in the woods. Carly would never talk about it. She just kept saying that it was over. She said she wanted to put it all behind her. Finally, Kelly bugged her so much she sent her this letter. For the first time, Carly told her the real story. Told her the horror she had seen with her own eyes. In her letter, Carly said she'd never told anyone this stuff before. The one time she tried, with her school shrink, the psychiatrist had quickly recommended she take medication. According to Carly, the hunter who attacked them was wearing Jason's hockey mask. The mask had possessed him and turned him evil. The mask had given him his power. Right now the mask is sitting at the bottom of Crystal Lake, Carly wrote at the end of her letter. It's over, Kelly. I'm asking you as a friend. Don't bring this up with me again. In fact, you should probably burn this letter, because if the wrong people ever get a hold of it, I'd probably be committed or something. Kelly, I know it hurts. It hurts me too. But you've got to remember. Kelly didn't read the last line. She didn't have to. She knew it by heart. You can obsess about this the rest of your life. It isn't going to bring Boone back. She flipped the page, her thin lips tightening. She knew she couldn't bring Boone back. Jesus, Carly, that wasn't the point. She hadn't been there for him. Hadn't been there for a brother who had always been there for her. Like the time when she was 11 and she and Marcy Nonenson were playing hide-and-seek down by the reservoir. They'd ended up getting found by some older kids from the poorer town of Dunhill. A bunch of bullies who kept poking the two girls with sticks and demanding that they do a striptease. Suddenly, out of nowhere, there was this roar. Boone came riding out of the woods on his motorcycle, which he didn't even have a license to ride yet. He scattered those kids like a flock of geese. When she was growing up, Kelly's parents had never really involved themselves with their children. They had had problems of their own. Boone had been more like Kelly's father than her real father. He was always teaching her cool stuff. How to ride a motorcycle, how to hotwire a car, how to pick a lock, how to survive in the woods with just a knife. Thinking about that last skill really tore at Kelly's heart, considering what had happened. Boone. As she lit another cigarette, Kelly noticed that her hand was shaking. Fast, tiny shakes like a hummingbird. And speaking of birds, they were just starting to twitter outside the kitchen window. The gloomy black-gray sky had changed abruptly to white-gray. The sun was coming up. Kelly rubbed her face. As usual, when she'd been up all night, she felt numb rather than tired. Her face had this thick feeling, and her vision seemed a little blurry around the edges, as if her face had shifted and her eyes weren't looking out the eye holes. And then abruptly she realized she was crying. No sound came out. Her face barely moved, but the tears flowed freely down her pale cheeks, a few tears curling into the corners of her mouth. She tasted salt. "No," she said softly, but the tears did not stop. She had gotten into the habit, over the months since his death, of talking to her older brother. At first she only did it in her head, but the last few weeks she had found it was more comforting, even if it seemed a little insane, when she talked to him out loud. "I've got a plan," she said. "Boone, I'm telling you, I've got a plan." Suddenly, Kelly's face wrenched tightly as sobs shook her. She wrapped her arms tightly around her thin body. She felt so cold. But at least when the tears finally subsided, her headache was gone. She looked down. Her eyes were wet, so now her vision was really blurred. But she kept flipping through the notebook. It was the last entries in her notebook that interested her the most. Man shoots wife, then self. Rabies outbreak claims 2 more lives. Boy 9 hangs dog. Elderly woman poisons neighbor. All the articles were datelined Crystal Lake. All were from the last year. Seemed like an awful lot of bad news for one town now, didn't it? Kelly cradled her coffee mug with both hands, held it up to her cheek. "He's back," she said quietly. She was sure of it. It, whatever it was that was bringing evil to that town had returned. And she was going to trap it, kill it, destroy it. She was going to get revenge. For Boone. For her. "I'm coming, Boone," she said. Boone didn't answer. Chapter 2. Ma and Pa. "Pa," Ma said sharply. Pa stopped snoring but didn't wake. Ma poked her husband in the ribs with the handle of the broom that she'd been using to sweep up their shack. "Get up!" He moaned into the pillow. "What time is it?" "Almost 7, for God's sake." "7?" Paul repeated, with a snort of disgust. He lay still a moment longer. "What day is it?" he asked. Ma's voice was even angrier now. "It's Thursday, fool!" Dramatically grunting and groaning, Paul finally sat up. Big mistake. The pounding in his head started up almost at once. Pa opened one eye. He stared at his old wife. He hated her guts for waking him. But the look on her face, cold as ice, scared him and made him look back down without a word. He swung his bare legs out of the bed and pretended to study his toes. Paul was a grizzled man of 70, with white hair and white whiskers and rotten teeth. But despite his age, he was still strong and powerful and broad-shouldered. When he was a young man, he used to scare the bejesus out of his wife and kid. Those were the days. When had the tables turned? Paul couldn't quite remember. "Why can't you ever let me sleep?" he growled. "Come home at a decent hour," Ma said, not bothering to look at him. "Then you'll sleep." The shack Ma was sweeping up was a tiny tar paper box set about 2 miles back from Crystal Lake. She tried hard to keep it clean, but somehow the place always looked filthy. There were 3 metal frame beds, one for Pa, one for Ma, one for Big Red. The mattresses had blankets but no sheets. Pa eyed his wife with suspicion. "What you gotta be in your bonnet for?" The big gray-haired woman was at the tiny gas-burning stove, where the dented old kettle was just beginning to whistle. "Just get up," she said. Paul rubbed his face with both hands. "Where's Big Red?" "He left us a note." "Fishing?" "Yep." Paul laughed bitterly. "That boy wouldn't know how to catch a fish if it had jumped into the boat and tried to up and kiss him." This exchange, or something close to it, was part of Ma and Pa's regular morning routine. But now Ma veered from the script. She turned quickly from the stove, and her eyes flashed darkly. "You watch your tongue!" Paul chuckled a little more, but he watched his tongue and said no more. He got out of bed and, barefoot, stepped gingerly across the cold floorboards. He removed his baggy old trousers from a hook on the wall and climbed into them, leaving on his white long john shirt. He slipped his suspenders over his big bony shoulders. "He's just in a child," Ma said, spooning large amounts of instant coffee into a tin mug. "Huh, child," Paul snorted. "He's 45 years old." "I said," Ma said firmly, "he's just in a child." "Well," the old man said, "I guess'n you're right." He made a tisk sound, sucking on a tooth. "He sure is a sweet boy." He knew that would please her. Ma crossed to the table. She didn't look at him, but he could tell from the way her shoulders relaxed slightly that his comment had worked its magic. He knew her so well, knew her like a book. "I fixed you some Krispies," Ma said curtly. Paul gave a satisfied grunt. As far as he was concerned, Rice Krispies was just about the only decent breakfast food known to man. "What time did you get in last night?" Ma asked as he took his place at the rickety wooden table. "Oh," he said, gazing off into space and wondering how big a lie he could risk under the circumstances. "I smelled your breath when you come in," Ma said. Under the circumstances, Paul decided he'd better not lie at all. "Off drinking, weren't you?" Ma demanded. "With Tuck and Bud?" To avoid having to answer, Paul jabbed a large spoonful of Krispies into his mouth. His head was pounding. And every time Ma spoke so harshly and loudly, the pain of his hangover jabbed into him more deeply. Ma sighed. "You never change now, do you?" "Oh, I don't know about that, Ma." "No, you never do, never did, never will." Ma was smiling now, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was an insane kind of smile, and it made Paul very uneasy. "I mean," Ma said, "after what happened." She trailed off, her voice catching. "Now, Ma," he tried for a placating tone. God, he hated this woman. Ma was working herself up to a fever pitch. "After everything that happened, you can still drink?" She spat out the words. "You're not fit for the hogs." It was one of her favorite insults. It drove Paul right up the wall. "Don't say that, Ma," he warned. "Don't say it." She looked delighted. I'll say it 'cause it's true." "Don't say it," he said coldly. Ma stuck her face right into his. Her breath was nothing to write home about either. This time she said the insult slowly and deliberately. "You're not fit for the hogs." Paul could only take so much. He had just reached his limit. Suddenly the anger was surging through him. He pushed away from the table. His mouth hung open. There were little Krispies stuck to his lips. "You never let up on me, do you?" "That's right." Ma bared her teeth. "All my life you held this over my head," Paul said. "It wasn't an accident. You understand? An accident." She slapped him then, hard across the face. It wasn't the first time. But coming on top of his wicked hangover, this slap felt like the blow of a sledgehammer. Paul raised his fist, but something in Ma's eyes scared him off. Instead of hitting her, he hit the table. He knocked a bowl of Krispies to the floor with a crash and a splash. He was shaking. So was Ma. Then she was screaming, "You messed up my shack, you filthy little—" She couldn't seem to find a bad enough word. Instead, she charged. She grabbed a fistful of his suspenders and Long John's shirt and shoved him. He went flying backwards so fast he bashed his head into the jutting edge of the wooden bookshelf. There weren't any books on that bookshelf. Ma used the shelf for those dead cactus plants of hers, 2 of which now landed on Pa's head, one right after the other. Ma was cackling now, and shouting at the same time, the laughter and the yelling all mixing together. "That's what you get," she kept saying. "That's what you get." Pa clutched his shaggy head of white hair and glared at her. Right then it happened. He felt something snap, felt it come over him. That white-hot heat of anger that usually only came when he was sussed up pretty good. He lunged. He reached for Ma's neck. By the look in his eye, she must have known what he intended to do with her neck if he ever got a hold of it, because she didn't let him touch her. She brought her knee up fast, catching him right between the legs. Amazing how much pain could come from that part of the body, even after all of these years. He crumpled to the floor. For an instant, it felt as if his insides were leaving him and floating upward to the roof of the shack. Then the agony took over. It hurt so much he couldn't even moan. Ma backed away. He was going to kill me, she thought, trembling. He must still be drunk, was her next thought. Maybe she should get a bucket of ice water from the pump and douse the old man's head. But she was afraid. What if he got back to his feet before she got the water? After that kick, he'd really be out for blood. So Ma changed directions, heading instead for the shelf above their bed. This was the matching shelf to the one Paul had just knocked into. Without taking her eyes off her fallen husband, she reached up with her hand and felt around for the shotgun. It wasn't there. And as she groped wildly, her hand touched something soft and warm. She whirled around in horror. Then she froze. As big as she and Paul were, and they were both big people, it still amazed her that they had produced such large offspring. Big Red had to stoop whenever he came into the shack. Right now, his huge, hulking body blocked out almost all the sunlight coming in through the window behind him. The sun lit up his giant outline in rays of bright yellow. Ma had her hand on the bare white skin of Big Red's left arm. She pulled it away as if she had stuck it in a fire. "Big Red?" Ma said. It came out almost like a question, because Big Red did not look like himself. For one thing, he had covered his face with some strange white mask. For another thing, he was holding the shotgun, and he was pointing it right at Ma. "What is it, boy?" Paul asked from the floor. "You find something?" Big Red didn't answer, didn't say a word. Ma and Pa would never know what was in his head, never know the image his glass eye was now showing him. In his head, he was seeing a scene that had once taken place in this very shack. Pa and his best friend sitting at the wooden table. Uncle Tuck and Uncle Bud passing around a large bottle of amber-colored whiskey, around and around. In the corner sat a battered wooden crib. Lying on his back in the crib was a big baby with bright red hair. The baby was crying. And every time the baby cried, Paul shouted at it to be quiet, which didn't work. The baby cried harder, until finally Paul got so mad he hit the baby with an iron. The iron left a V-shaped indentation in the baby's skull. The scene faded from Big Red's brain, but the hate remained. He turned his head away from Ma and watched as Paul struggled to his feet. Paul held out his hand toward Big Red. "Give me the gun," he ordered. Big Red didn't move. Paul started walking slowly toward him. "Little boys aren't supposed to be playing with guns," Paul said. Now how many times I gotta tell you that? Pa stepped closer, but something about the way Big Red was looking at him made him stop short. Maybe it was the way both of Red's eyes were gleaming behind the dark holes of the mask. Big Red, Ma sobbed, give Pa the gun like a good boy. Come on, Big Red, Pa said, and then Pa grabbed for the barrel of the gun. Big Red squeezed his finger. The shotgun roared. Pa was only a foot away. The double barrels blasted a big hole right through Pa's stomach and out through the wall of the shack behind it, so that for one crazy second, Big Red could see pine trees right through his paw. Then Pa dropped to the floor like a sack of seed. Ma dropped as well, falling to her knees. Her arms were spread wide. She was screaming. Screaming just like she had that time so long ago when Big Red was still a baby. Big Red could see the scene in his head, see it clearly on the back of his glass eye, as if that glass eye were a little TV set in his brain. On that night so many years ago, Ma had come in the door and found the drunk men and her baby. Ma picked up the baby. The red-haired baby wasn't crying anymore. It didn't even seem to be breathing. Ma turned to Pa and started to scream. The scene went dark and Big Red was staring down at his old Ma again. The old woman was still on her knees and crying. Boy, Ma sure had gotten mad at Pa back then. But that was all she had done. Gotten mad. Big Red reloaded the gun. He stepped toward his mother, limping less than usual on his artificial leg. Okay, this has been the prologue and chapters 1 and 2 of Friday the 13th, Jason's Curse by William Pattison, a.k.a. Eric Morse. I hope you guys are enjoying this book so far. I love that it is a direct sequel to Friday the 13th Mother's Day, and that it actually is a story about Boone's sister. We all remember Boone from Mother's Day, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this book turns out, and I'm going to be doing the entire series that Eric Morse, William Pattison wrote, including the never-released, never-published Friday the 13th, book number 5, The Mask of Jason Voorhees. That'll be the last one I do. So yeah, guys, let me know in the comments section what you think of this book and this book series. I'd love to hear from you guys. And I'll be back very soon with some more of Friday the 13th, Jason's Curse. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening. Have a great night. I'll see you soon.
I didn't know